Focus on quantity, not in quality. Back then, for weeks and weeks on end, my pile of drawings would be taller and taller than the last time. For a while, I was proud of that. It was proof that I was serious about art. But with every drawing I did, with a stack of pages growing taller and taller, I never seemed to progress in the way I wanted to. Somehow, I still felt like I was falling behind. There's a corner of my little studio that has around 6 full envelopes of drawings made on printer paper. It's been untouched for a little while now, but just to help you visualize just how much of it there is, it's probably 4 reams of printer paper all stacked on top of each other. They were drawings of drawings, sketches upon sketches of the same subject. The advice, prioritize quantity over quality, was something I took seriously. If I wasn't satisfied with how a drawing looked, you'd definitely find me repeating that for an absurd amount of time until I get what I want out of it. Not only that, when I got the advice, draw this a lot of times to imprint it on your memory, I would do just that. I drawed a couple 100 times. I'd like to say that was a joke, but it really isn't. And it kind of sounds a little crass, like, oh, I did so many drawings that year, but just hear me out a little. When I finished the Drawbox course back in late 2021, I immediately went into studying anatomy. I started with a skull. I ended up with a little over 300 skulls. As you can see, I wasn't lacking in the amount of stuff I drew. I got used to finishing the day off with more than 20 drawings, but looking back, they didn't look very good. It got me enough mileage to understand the basics of the subject I was drawing. I got a general sense of how to draw a subject, but I never really got to take that further. Or rather, I was led by misbelief that it was all I needed to study. At some point, I noticed I was stagnating and not really succeeding in the art studies I was engaged in. I did the same thing, draw the same subject 50 times, but never really making changes to the way I practiced. I thought it was just because of the subject matter I chose, but no. It was a problem with the way I practiced. This is something I recently just realized, actually, just this morning when I was drawing a study for the gouache portrait. I was struggling with identifying values and seeing these shadow shapes. I thought it was an issue with the way I handled my pencil, so I thought about taking a break from my portrait studies to study drapery. Anyway, it wasn't an issue with the subject. The trouble I was dealing with was an issue with how I saw values. To put it simply, I couldn't read the values on a subject. My eye isn't used to identifying these tonal values yet. No matter how simple a subject is, I still can't train the way I identified values. Basically, I was trying to read something in a language I hadn't yet understood. And even as I'm writing this, I'm still practicing how I organize values. But this isn't an episode about values and tonal relationships. Had I applied the same way I practice in art right now in the past, I would have gotten further into my skills. But I guess everything has its own time. At some point I was paralyzed because I noticed I was stagnating in my skills. I wasn't moving forward. I went deep into rabbit holes of completely different subject matters to study. Machines, concept art, a reindeer. All of them weren't a part of my goals as an artist. Again, I blamed it on the subject I was learning to draw. Ethan Becker said this in one of his videos. Perfect practice makes progress. And I guess I overlooked the whole strategy side of the way I trained in art every day. The problem with the advice I followed was, if I focused on only the quantity of my work, that would eventually equal progress. But instead, it did more harm than good, and I'm still trying to shed some of the habits I developed when I had that mindset. When I realized I had to study how to shade a drawing, I thought it would only take a couple 100 drawing exercises to get good at it. Back then, I still wasn't able to control my pencil as decently as I do now, and even with my current skill set, it's still got a long way to go. I quickly caught up on the idea that my control of the pencil wasn't going to be developed overnight, but over years. In the first year of me trying to practice more advanced fundamentals like shading a drawing, I was disappointed when I wouldn't finish a day off with pages of drawings. When I was forced to slow down while I was first practicing how to draw still life, I had to get used to developing a drawing not over minutes or by hours, but by days. And even now, I find it difficult to internalize the idea that I could be working to finish a drawing in a couple of days, maybe even weeks. I wasn't coming out of every week with 50 drawings. I was coming out of every week with at least 2 or 6 if the practice sessions were good days. Because of how complicated and how much time it took to actually render a drawing, I was forced to get used to the saying, "You can't rush art." And I really don't know why I hadn't thought of that any sooner. It's one of those things that sound obvious until you realize it isn't, only until someone calls it out. I don't know why I never made it a habit to assess my drawings. Every time I'd come out of a drawing session, I'd base its success over the amount I did. I was confusing movement with progress. I was confusing long-term growth with the quantity of the amount of drawings I got done. Quantity over quality eventually led me to frequent burnouts. Burnouts I didn't know the cause of. It wasn't a very good learning experience. I remember literally taking off boxes off my to-do list that said, "Draw 50 skulls today," and if I didn't meet those expectations, I felt disappointment in myself and the practice I did that day. At the time, if I didn't reach that certain amount of drawings, it meant I was being too slow in my progress, and it meant I wasn't getting anywhere. Practicing how to render a drawing isn't developed overnight. You gotta learn how to control your pencil, see shadow shapes, organize values, design those shadow shapes, learn anatomy for better design. I know, it's a lot. What I wish they said instead was this: quantity over time, focus on quality practice right now. Maybe that is what they meant, but it would have been nice to know word by word before I spent countless hours trying to draw 500 skulls and 50 different trees. Now I know what you're thinking, but won't that mean we won't get enough muscle memory developed? Won't our progress be slow? I get where you're coming from. I used to be in the same boat, and actually, I think I'm still trying to get rid of this fear of slowing down. A great book to read about this is Slow Productivity by Cal Newport. There's a story in there that talked of a musician who focused on leveling up her skills before accepting big-time recording studios. Now, of course, I'm not saying you should shun these opportunities. I'm just saying you should focus on what you can bring and bring well that can be of quality. And that quality is developed over time with intentional and diligent practice. I believed back then that if I just drew the same thing over and over again, I'd get good at that. In some ways, yes, that's true. The problem with this is that you can be getting practice in by drawing the same thing over and over, but if you don't stop and assess what you're doing wrong or doing right, you could be developing some bad habits that will be difficult to shed in the long term. When I was too hyper-focused on drawing more and more every day, I also began measuring the effectiveness of the practice session by the amount of hours I did. When the lockdown happened and I had a lot of time after online class, I draw for around 8 hours a day, straight, with 8-minute breaks. Which, on the surface, sounds like it's good. And it is. If I had a clear goal of what I was studying. It's sort of like being given advice that sounds useful, but when you pause and think of it, it sounds more like there's something you need to know more of before actually taking that advice. You know what I mean. They tell you to practice, but when you sit down to pause and think about it, you ask yourself, well, what do I practice? There's a lot of things you have to consider when you want to practice. Let's simplify it. It's a generally accepted truth in the art community that if you study anatomy, you'll get better at drawing. But if your goal is landscape painting, then why are you studying anatomy? Don't worry, I used to believe the same thing. That when I studied XYZ fundamental, I'd somehow magically improve in my drawings. But there's something else that needs to be considered when you're studying and practicing art. The intent and goal of your practice sessions are more important than the amount you can draw in a day. Of course, in some instances like gesture drawing, you'd definitely like to have more drawings done to get used to finding the pose quickly, but if you don't stop for a second and analyze what you're doing wrong and doing right at your gesture drawings, then you could be at risk of solidifying bad habits. Again, it's about quality work accumulated over time, which equals progress. Eventually, I realized that slower never meant slow progress. It meant being more intentional with my practice. It meant I had to think before I practiced, and it meant I had to be smart about my practice. When I heard that advice, focus on quantity over quality, I developed the habit of only putting in the hours in the amount I did, trying to draw as much as possible, as often as possible. But when I began focusing on what I needed to learn, putting more energy into what I needed to focus on. When I began being more intentional, I finally began to progress. Sure, I don't produce the same amount of drawings as I used to, but when I finally adopted this new mindset and way of practicing art, I began to learn more. Maybe progress doesn't mean instant countless drawings. Maybe you're not behind. Maybe we're just supposed to progress slowly, naturally. I try not to count the pages I fill anymore, if I can help it. I ask myself what I've learned, what I've noticed, and what I enjoy. And that's become enough. And it should be.